The Israeli-Palestinian conflict, to me, is one big blur of confusion. And I've got two people here who have a lot of knowledge about the subject. First of all, Alon Ben Meir, who is a professor at NYU, New York University. He teaches international relations, and he's an expert on conflict resolution. And here in Toronto is Robert Katz, who is a social worker, and he's very engaged with this topic. He is on the national board of the Canadians for Peace Now, and he's the chair of the Toronto chapter. So what I'd like to do is ask, I think, Alon, Professor Ben Meir, I think I would like for you to start us off by giving us History 101 about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict.
So I want to go 100 years back to, say, 1917 with the Balfour Declaration. Of course, you might go even further back than that. But with the Balfour Declaration, that's where the Arab states, specifically the Palestinian, began awaken to the fact something is going to happen, might happen, they are going to object to under any and all circumstances. And so going back, as I said, to 1917, but from my perspective, the real conflict, the more violent conflict, really began with the partition plan. When the United Nations in 1947 decided on the partition plan to create a Palestinian state and Israeli state. Israel accepted the partition plan, the Palestinians refused the partition plan, and several Arab states, along with the Palestinians, waged a war against Israel. And now that's the war of 1948. We call it the War of Independence. And during that war, Israel, in fact, regained further territories beyond what the partition plan designated for the state of Israel. And that was in 1948. But to understand the real issue here, why is it, after so many years, more than 7 decades, the two sides still do not really see eye to eye? We have to look at a number of 3 or 4 different issues that have not really been put on the table. And I must tell you that in my work, and having been involved directly in some of these negotiations, specifically track 2, and I try to bring these issues, they really never understand that unless you reconcile 3 things, you are not going to be able to sit down and make the kind of concession necessary in order to reach an agreement. So what are the 3 things that are critically important? One is the historical narrative. That is, neither side have been able to this day to reconcile their historical narrative. The Palestinians claim this is our territory, you waged a war against us, you caused the Nakba, which they call the catastrophe of 1948, that caused the massive refugees, Palestinian refugees, and that is their starting point. From the Israeli perspective, when the United Nations made the partition plan, we accepted the partition plan, you refused it, you waged a war against us. And of course, all of that has to be also taken in the context of what the Israelis, what the Jews actually just have experienced only a few years back, that is in the wake of during World War II. That is the catastrophe, the Holocaust. So you have to put the catastrophe, they call the Nakba of 48, juxtaposed to the Holocaust, to understand not only how we cannot, the historical narrative, but the problem in trying to reconcile that. How will the Jews ever forget the Holocaust and the determination not to establish a state of their own where they can live peacefully, without threats and without intimidation? And this, for the Palestinians, this is our land, and we want to live independently from anyone else, just the same. Then there is the other element with the psychological dimension of the conflict. And what is that? That is, there's a set of belief. That is, we, psychologically speaking, the Palestinians now have created a problem for themselves in terms of, for example, the refugee problem. This is the right of return. For them, the right of return is a sine qua non to establishing a Palestinian state. So here, it's been extremely difficult to convince the Palestinian that the right of return is no longer viable under any circumstances. And throughout many of the negotiations that took place, the Palestinians understood that, but to this day they continue to claim that part of the solution has to be the right of return, albeit that's not going to happen. The second thing, they want to start from the negotiation from the 1967 borders. 1967 war, Israel gained 3 times the size of its territory. It was in the West Bank, in Syria, as well as in Egypt. It returned the territories to Egypt. It returned the territories to Jordan. It retained the Golan Heights from Syria, but it refused to relinquish any of the territories occupied in 1967. Albeit Israel offered in 1967, we're willing to relinquish all of these territories for peace, except Jerusalem, where this is our capital, and we will never relinquish our right to Jerusalem. The Palestinians turned that down as well. That is
you just told me something I didn't know. I think you're saying that Jerusalem was acquired during the 1967 war?
Absolutely.
I didn't know
all
that.
of it.
Okay,
yes.
There you go.
East and the West, of course, was under Israeli control, and then Israel took the east side along with the Western Wall, the Wailing Wall.
Oh, I didn't know that. Okay.
Yeah, and that is Israel from day one refused to ever consider returning any part of East and West Jerusalem to the Palestinians. Mm-hmm. Albeit, there still are room, some kind of arrangement where the Palestinian can be satisfied with that. And then there's the third element, the ideological. That is the ideology. That is Israel, going back now, you can go back centuries for that matter. The persecution of the Jews. This is the idea was that the Zionist organization was all about the creation of the Zionist organization, is to build a home, a refuge for the Jews. And and mind you, even Herzl at the time, they were not even thinking in terms of Palestine. They were thinking of establishing a Jewish state almost anywhere. So in Uganda or in the part of the United States, as long as there was Jewish entity where the Jews can live safely without threat and without danger. But they realized subsequently that this is not going to happen. That's the affinity to the land, the historic relation to the land, biblically speaking, practically speaking, emotionally and psychologically speaking, that affinity to the land cannot be relinquished under any circumstances. And the only place to build a Jewish state is to go back to the land of Israel, biblically speaking, historically speaking. And so today, if you were to ask me then, what are the stumbling blocks here? Why is it that suicide cannot see eye to eye? We can reduce that to 4 major issues. One is territory. That is, Palestinians continue to demand the territory going back to 1967. And they claim that we are already making major concessions because 1967 borders are much larger than the partition plan, but we're willing to relinquish that. We go back to the June 4th, 1967.
No, wait a minute. Let me get this. The dispute is over where to set the borders.
Begin to negotiate the border, yes.
Negotiate. And the original borders were much smaller for Israel.
In 1948, yes.
Yes, and then the war in 67.
Expanded that significantly to the current border, the current legal border.
The Palestinians are asking for what? 47?
Well, they're asking for the land, that's number one. Number two, they want demanding the right of return of the Palestinians. The right of return of the Palestinians.
They want the 40 to negotiate from the 47 boundaries.
Border, that's one issue. Okay. The second one is demanding the right of return, that all the Palestinians that reside elsewhere, for example, in Jordan, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Iraq, and all of the Arab states, would have the right to come back to a Palestinian state in Palestine, which from the Israeli perspective.
Can I throw in a tiny caveat here, just for explanation, not disagreeing?
Sure.
When they are talking about right of return, they are not talking about right of return to the West Bank. They're talking about right of return to anywhere within Israel.
To Palestine, to a state of Palestine.
So they are talking about a return not simply to the West Bank, but to the whole 1948 mandate area.
No. They are talking about the right of return to the Palestinian state, wherever that Palestinian state is going to be created, in the West Bank, in Gaza, or perhaps other parts of Palestine. They are talking about return to the Palestinian state.
Right. I just wanted to clarify for people who haven't followed this, the right of return is not limited to Gaza and the West Bank. It is, as you say, everything. The second thing I wanted to note about right of return, it doesn't just refer to people who are living in the Middle East. Right of return includes the great-grandson of somebody who moved to Mississauga after the war. So right of return includes tons and tons of people way beyond people who are refugees.
Oh, well, has anybody proposed?
No, let me say it again.
Okay.
Right of return is reference to the refugees, not Palestinians who voluntarily left and live in Canada or live in the United States, and even the Palestinians who choose to stay in Jordan or to stay in Syria, that's perfectly okay with them. Right of return is reference to the refugees that are still in refugee camps in Jordan, in Palestine, even in Gaza. I mean, when I argue with them about this, I tell them, you have refugee camps in Gaza, but you are already on your own land. You claim this land to be yours. You cannot be a refugee on your own land. You may be internally displaced, but you are not a refugee. The same thing in the bank. Many you might call internally displaced, but they are not refugees. So there is extensive argument in defining who has the right to return. But by and large, the reference is always to the refugees but the number of refugees, where there were like 600,000 or 700,000 at the time, now it's 5.5 million people because of their children and grandchildren and all of that. Which again, that's another issue of conflicting issue. Are these in fact the children? Are these in fact still refugees? So what I'm saying is the whole issue of the refugees is one major stumbling block. And mind you,
I want to get clear. Sounds like you guys disagree. That Bob, you're saying that it includes everybody who's a grandson of anybody who ever left for any reason.
Not so much that we disagree,
but you know, maybe partly. Is there a real disagreement among different factions or different Palestinian communities?
That right of return refers to anybody whose descendants left. Others are more pragmatic, as Alon is describing them, and will accept it refers only to people who are currently refugees in the Middle East. But even there, it will include people who are working as engineers in the Emirates. It'll include people all over.
Whoever wants to go back. Whoever wants to go back. That's the point. Or any Palestinian who wants to go back. Mind you,
it's still not clear. Because if it sounds like you have totally different demands here. Some people, a much larger group, would be eligible than others. It would seem to me really difficult if you said everybody who's a grandson of anybody practically. But if you say people who actually lived in Palestine and their descendants, then that's still a lot of people, but that's a different size of community altogether. So is there any real agreement as to which is meant and what the real bottom line demand is?
There is no real agreement. The issue here is whether they are living in X state or this other country. Right of return refer to any Palestinian who wants to go back to Palestine. They have the right to go back to Palestine. The focus, however, has always been in practical terms on the refugees. But who's refugee? For example, in Jordan, more than half of the population are Palestinians. originally, they were all refugees. But if you were to ask them today, do you want to go back to Palestine? 90% say no, we are staying in Jordan because we are Jordanian. We've been living here all our lives. All the descendants, they were all born in Jordan. So they have no interest in going. So you understand there's a practical aspect to it and there's a theoretical aspect to it. Practically, if it's allowed to go back, no more than 10% actually would choose to go back to Palestine.
But let me ask another, what I think is a practical question. Probably it will sound even offensive. And that is, has anybody really talked seriously about compensating the people the refugees, and giving them tons of money for the land that they claim they should have? I mean, if you paid them enough, it might not look so bad. But I kind of think it's not even nice to mention that it's kind of...
No, it's been discussed many times.
Is it?
It's not a question of it. This has been discussed many times. In fact, that is the only thing that in practical terms, this is the only thing practical is compensation or resettlement or both. That is resettlement, you pay for resettling them back, or you compensate them for if they want to choose to stay. This has been very open-ended discussion. There's nothing insulting about it. Because practically speaking, this is the only way, resettlement and or compensation.
I just wanted to be clear that there's ambiguity on the right of return, and I think you've covered it as well as anybody could cover it. That's
one. The second one, very important, is Jerusalem. They want to establish a capital in East Jerusalem. This is a very contentious issue for the Israelis. And right now, even those Israelis from the center, or some of them even left of center, are not willing to relinquish East Jerusalem because it has biblical affinity and it has historical. Jerusalem is mentioned in the Old Testament 700 times. 700 times. So this has not just come from nowhere. So for the Israeli Jerusalem, again, that is not something which they are willing to put on the negotiating table, albeit there are possibilities where the Palestinians can establish some kind of a municipality of sort if they were to have a state of their own.
That's the position of the majority of Israelis. I want to point out our organization, Peace Now, rejects that. Peace Now believes you have to have a divided Jerusalem. The Palestinians have to have a place to live in Jerusalem, complete access to the dome. And we understand that one of the worst things happening in Jerusalem right now is that settlers are encroaching on the neighborhoods in which Palestinians live, which will make it much more difficult to divide it up when it has to be divided up.
Yes, this is a very important point, and that is, I happen to agree with you in terms of solution. But the city itself, under any circumstances, will never be redivided. That is, if you go today to Jerusalem, the Palestinians from the east side or Jews from the west side, they go in and out. There's no borders, there's no identification, nothing. It is one city. The roads, the electric grill, everything is one city. The sewage system, everything is one city. It will never be divided by any wall. There will be only a political line, you might say, a political line that would designate east from west. And that is the only way, and the Palestinians understand that. There's no question. Their right to go to the Dome of the Rock, and to pray there, that is a given. In fact, Israel never really interfered in that. It has been under the Jordanian custodianship from day one. To this day, the Jordanians still pay for administration of the Temple Mount. That is where the Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock are. The Jordanians have the custodianship over the holy places in Jerusalem, not the Palestinians. He says we have to keep that, and that has not changed from day one. And the Israelis do not want to change that. But security, it's in the hand of the Israelis to make sure that the whole area is secured, because Jews go and pray on the wall. This is the outer wall of the Second Temple, and on top of it is you have the Dome of the Rock and the Aqsa Mosque right on top of the wall. So it's a single unit. So the Jews have that right to go to the Western Wall, and the Palestinians, the Arabs can go to the upper side. Israel maintains security all over, but the administration of the mosque is in the hand of the Jordanian. So if you look at the solution to Jerusalem, is no division, but the right of the Palestinian to establish a capital of their own in East Jerusalem without in fact dividing the city. The division will be a political one. And mind you, when Trump recognized Jerusalem as Israel capital, if you read the document carefully, he said that all the eventual borders between Israel and the Palestinians in Jerusalem is for them to decide.
Is what?
For the Israelis and the Palestinians to decide. This is very important. Most Palestinian and Jordanian ignore that single sentence. It's in the document that he actually, it looks like here all of Jerusalem is for the Israelis, but in fact he said that ultimately they need to decide for themselves where to draw that kind of political line without dividing the city, which is very important to keep in mind. Then the issue, of course, the settlement, the third one, which is the big stumbling point here. Many Israelis, specifically, of course, the settlement movement, are represented very strongly in every single government. And no one can think in terms of leaving the 3 blocks of settlement that's housed nearly 600,000 settlers. And you have another 100 small settlements scattered all over the West Bank. But they also have a big settlement, Ariel, which sticks inside the West Bank 12 miles. And that's a city, not a settlement. It has a university. It has nearly 38,000 Israelis living in Ariel. Or Ma'ale Edomim, it's another city, and they're 3 kilometers from Jerusalem. So what you have also, you have 3 blocks of settlement along the 1967 border. And mind you, in every single negotiation, the Palestinians agreed, and I repeat that, agreed that these settlements remain under Israeli control against land swap. That is for Israel to give them equal mass of land, of quality, and contiguous to the West Bank. It has to be contiguous. Mm-hmm. And if you look at the so-called deal of the century, none of the sectors there is a land swap, but it is not contiguous, which means nothing for the Palestinians. So here they agreed to maintain this, but they did not want another 75 settlements scattered all over the West Bank with 300, 400, 500 settlers in each. So the vast majority will be able to stay within the Israeli settlement, the 3 blocks along the border. 70 to 100,000 will have to be relocated, and they can all go to the other settlements if that's in an eventual agreement. So this is a major stumbling block in terms of what settlement can stay, how much land swap, and then mind you, the negotiation with Olmert, they almost 90% agreed on all of these issues except the percentage of the land swap. Believe it or not, that destroyed, scattered the whole.
There was one other major disagreement, and that was what you mentioned before, Ariel, which in 2000, I would even say that it was more than 90% they had agreed on, but Ariel was one that neither side would give.
It was a big
this
problem.
Is the side just being sticking out like a thumb into the West Bank.
Exactly. That was a big problem because Israel could not see how it could relinquish a city. It's no longer an area, a settlement. We call it a settlement, but it's a practically small city.
Now, what is the city again, the name of it?
It has everything, like a city, like universities, like...
How do you spell it?
A-R-I-E-L?
A-R-I-E-L.
And that's like a city inside what would be the Palestinian...
In the West Bank. It's in the West Bank, along with Ma'ale Edomim. It's also a very big city. In fact, if you go there, you don't think this is a settlement. This is a city. The fourth issue is who is to control the Jordan Valley. From the Israeli perspective, they want to make sure that there'll be no infiltration of terrorism or terrorists or military hardware coming from the Jordan into through the West Bank to Israel. So Israel insists on maintaining the security along the Jordan Valley. And
how would they do that?
Well, by having military presence, which they have currently there. There have always been significant military Israeli presence along the Jordan River, along the Jordan Valley. So that's still there. As a matter of fact, with Trump plans, Israelis will be allowed to annex that part of that, which is for the Palestinians is simply a sequence. That's not totally unacceptable. So that's the fourth issue that you have, very, very contentious issue that need to be resolved. Interestingly enough, like Bob was saying, more than 90% of these issues were settled between the negotiation between Olmert and Abbas going back to 2009, 2008 and 9.
Which are the worst, the most intractable issues?
Well, they're really all intractable. I think the land swap is very significant. The settlement of the refugee problem has been resolved. As a matter of fact, the Palestinians agreed many times that they understood that Israel cannot absorb any significant number of Palestinians and maintain its Jewish character. This simply is not going to happen. So, but it's not a question of right and wrong. Israel wants to maintain the Jewish character of the state, and is not prepared to have more Palestinians living as Israeli citizens than Israelis themselves. So that's not going to happen. So,
now, I agree completely with that, but I do want to throw in a note that when Arafat was negotiating, hopefully in good faith, that was the stumbling block that caused him to walk out of the negotiations and call for an intifada instead of further negotiations. That was the stumbling block. He didn't even make a counter offer. And what he said at the time was, I will not negotiate away the rights of the grandchildren of the Palestinian people. He subsequently said he was sorry he had done that, but it was too late.
Yeah, you're right. That was in 2000 at Camp David. At Camp David with President Clinton at the time, they also reached almost an agreement on all the issues with Yasser Arafat. But the contentious issue was exactly that. He agreed about what's the right of return is going to be, but he has refused to sign on the dotted line that this is a final arrangement. This is a final understanding. He said, no, the next generation will decide what is going to be. So he refused to sign the dotted line that this agreement would have been final as far as the right of return is concerned. So Bob is absolutely, this is an important point to keep in mind. So what happened, if you were to ask me today, any government in Israel, which is right of center, like Netanyahu, or any government that is right of center, will not allow the establishment of a Palestinian state. And Netanyahu said that scores of times. There will be no Palestinian state under my watch. That is why he embraced very strongly the Trump so-called deal of the century, because that basically will diminish any prospect of establishing.
Okay, I need to hear what the deal of the century is. I assume you're referring to this thing that Trump is so proud of. I mean, what does it consist of, and why would anybody who has got the support of both sides to most of these demands then say no to a Palestinian state? Because it would seem to me the whole purpose of settling these 4 points would be to enable the creation of two different states.
Deal of the century is a Trump term. It wasn't a deal. A deal involves two sides agreeing to something. There was never a deal. This was Trump's idea of the century, but it certainly wasn't something the two sides.
There was no deal. Yeah, that was a proposal. It was embraced by Israel because Netanyahu basically sat with Kushner and others, and they decided how it's going to be, which would allow Israel to annex additional 30% of the West Bank in Area C, which is for the Palestinian, again, that was totally non-starter.
Okay, he would not allow the creation of a Palestinian state. Well, isn't there one already? I mean, the West Bank has the PLO and PLA or whatever it is. Uh, isn't that a state? Isn't it? What's the problem?
There is no state. It's not recognized by the United Nations Security Council. Only a couple of countries recognize that. And it is basically municipalities scattered all over the West Bank. There's no contiguous landmass. If a Palestinian wants to travel from area A to area B or to C, they have 5 different checkpoints to go through. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's the most miserable thing you can possibly imagine. I've been there scores of times. And I said to myself, if I were a Palestinian and I need to go 3 miles from one area to another and I'd be stopped 4 times. Imagine how it feels when you think this is my land and this is the occupying power is doing to me. So I'm absolutely against the so-called deal of the century, which has not come to fruition, and I hope it will never come to fruition, because that would mean endless war between the two sides.
Well, but okay, now if he's saying no Palestinian state, what he's saying is a continuation of this situation where the Palestinians are really occupied territory. Or
Israel, yes, many Israelis believe that the current status quo can be sustained almost indefinitely, because Israel maintains such a formidable military power and presence that the Palestinians have simply no chance of ever winning a war against Israel. So from the Israeli perspective, it's a reality. We're going to have to live with it. And they think it's sustainable. And I don't think it is sustainable. Because then I have another element, and that's Hamas. Whereas some Palestinians are willing to sit down and have a 2-state solution, Hamas is not interested in a 2-state solution, at least not yet. So this is a very militant group who are basically still do not recognize Israel's existence, although the Palestinian Authority did recognize Israel's right to exist. So you have here, within the Palestinian, that's the 5th point I wanted to make, there is a disagreement in terms of how to deal with Israel. That has not, and as long as the Palestinians themselves do not agree as to what to do, well, the conflict is going to continue for as far as I can see. That is another problem that needs to be resolved. Again, I advance, like several others, a comprehensive approach to this whole of thing, how to go about it, because I deal with conflict resolution, and I understand the mindset of the people involved, the history of the people involved, and all of that. I still believe that a 2-state solution is the only practical one, the only viable one, albeit it would be the road to achieve it is going to be extremely treacherous, extremely difficult, but the only way is for Israel, A, to remain a democracy, to remain a Jewish state, which is central to the very creation of the state of Israel to begin with, to have a Jewish democratic state. If they want to maintain the characteristics as such, they've got to allow the Palestinians to establish a state of their own. But then that's got to go through a process. And this is a very important point that I wrote about it, 2 books on the subject. And this is a process, which means if you sit down today and reach an agreement between the two sides, almost on all issues, it will not work. You need to create a process whereby people to people in every single walk of life need to work together and cooperate. Like it used to be in the 80s. Israelis used to go to the West Bank, do their shopping and everything, and go back to Israel. The Palestinians would go back and forth, which means there's 2-state. For all intent and purposes, however, it's like a single state. There's only political border between the two sides, which means you need a process of reconciliation. That process of reconciliation is people to people in every respect, also government to government. That process has to be, it's a prerequisite. It has to be the forerunner before you actually say, now that we have a permanent peace between the two sides. That is, permanent peace will not take place unless you have that process, because you have extremists on both sides, Israelis as well as Palestinians, who are not interested in a 2-state solution.
your approach would be to start with the people uh, and create harmony, more harmony there.
As a process, you have to create a process. Let me give you an example why such a process is critical. If you go to Palestinian schools and look at the textbooks, you don't see Israel map in geography books. It doesn't exist. So the kids, Palestinian kids, they grow up, and Israel for them is the foremost enemy. The Jew is an enemy. The Jew, they see a Jew as a soldier. They don't see the Jew in any other way. And you go to look at some of the Israeli books, and also you find, denial of the Palestinian right, as if they were no people. They are just there, inhabited. They were there. So, which means process of reconciliation, for example, would require modifying history books to reflect exactly what actually happened. Without that, the new generation is growing reading books that are totally do not reflect the reality, the truth. The truth is not there. So this is just one example. But I'm talking about already that articles, exchanging people, exchanging students, women, Palestinian women, to go to Israel and see how women Israelis live, to go to the beach and see what's going on. You need that interaction in between the people. And that is the only thing that can sustain a relationship between two countries who are juxtaposed to one another, because there's another big problem. That is the interdisbursement of the Jews in Jerusalem and in Israel proper. You have 2 million Palestinians in Israel proper as Israeli citizens. You have Jerusalem with 250,000 Palestinians and 400,000 Israelis. You have Gaza with 2 million Palestinians, and you have Israelis living in the West Bank, 750,000 among 2.5 million people. This interdisbursement cannot be undone. That is why you cannot create hard borders.
Well, the interspersement still sounds like they're not really interacting much.
Depends where, depending where.
Here, which I think will deal with interaction in part. And you mentioned that it is a political problem, and in many ways it is much more a political problem than people realize. The reason that Israel always had trouble making peace offers is because the religious parties have almost always held the balance of power, whether you had a Labour government or a Likud government. They were able to wag the dog. And so a very small number of ultra-religious parties, which wanted the whole of Israel, they wanted everything, were able to push the government to do silly things. And they didn't necessarily represent what mainstream Israelis believed, but they did represent control of parliament.
How
now,
come?
with the Palestinians,
why did they have so much power?
Because you've got proportional representation. People who vote for, if you have a very small percentage of people who vote for these ultra-religious parties and the other parties are in balance, in order to form a government, you grab the ultra-religious, and then you have to agree with what they're saying. That in Gaza, which very correctly, it is militant, doesn't believe Israel should exist. There are lots of people who do believe that there should be a peaceful settlement. And there are lots of Israelis who are sending money to people they know in the Gaza Strip because they used to work together and they don't want them to be starving. So there is this wellstream of possible goodwill, except that Hamas and the more radical factions won't allow it to happen.
There's a religious group do hold sway in government because of the settler movement, and they have representation in all the government. But mind you, however, during the Olmert negotiation, Israel was prepared to make significant concession to reach an agreement. It did not happen. At Camp David, Ehud Barak, who was the prime minister then, made significant concession, willingly willing to have a two-state solution. In 1967, Eshkol offered all the territories back, with the exception of Jerusalem. The Palestinians refused that. So you might say, I'm all 100% in favor of Palestinian state, but the Palestinians, unfortunately, missed many, many opportunities. I just wrote a major work on it. For example, what happened with the recognition of normalization of relations between Doha, between the United Arab Emirates and Israel. And the Palestinians, of course, were against that. Well, the Arab state, and that's the other element that I mentioned to you. Arab state came up with the Arab Peace Initiative in 2002. That in and of itself already implied willingness of the Arab state to recognize Israel if Israel were to return the territories captured in 1967. And they did not even call the Palestinian refugees by name. They said a just solution to the refugee problem, without saying Palestinian refugees, because Israel claimed there were also Jewish refugees at the time. So the Arab Peace Initiative, in my view, was in 2002, was valid then, and it remains valid today. What I'm saying, though, the fact that some Arab states, because of Iran, specifically the Gulf state, this is a very complicated situation there. The Gulf state, after waiting 70 years, they've been backing the Palestinian every single day, in terms of their right for a Palestinian state. But many of the Arab states, specifically in the Gulf now, of course, Jordan went its own, Egypt went before that, 79. But the movement that took place recently by the United Arab Emirates and normalizing relations, it's because of the Iranian threat. This is, in my view, given a Palestinian another opportunity. And I spoke to top officials just recently. I said, listen, you're rejecting the normalization of relations. I want you to understand, I said, Bahrain is going to come next. Oman is going to be next. Saudi Arabia will come next. What they have done basically is saying to you, look, we still back two-state solution, but we cannot wait 70 more years because it's an Iranian threat, and Israel is the major power in the Middle East that can actually deal with Iran. They don't trust, really, believe it or not, they don't trust the Trump administration to come to their aid if there's going to be significant problem with Iran. They rely more on Israel. And I was told this by top leaders themselves. Israel had, so their enemies, so the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And that's how they view Israel. That is another opening now for the Palestinians to say, okay, we're willing to sit and negotiate and basically to kill the so-called deal of the century, the Trump proposal for peace. If they were just willing, and I said, please think about it in those terms. Sit down and say, we're willing to begin negotiation unconditionally, starting from square one if you have to. Every time they start to negotiate, they had to negotiate from scratch. That was the most horrifying mistake they made all these years. That is, if you negotiate 15 years ago and reach an agreement on, for example, the land swap, I would put this aside. We agreed on land swap. Even if the negotiation fall apart and resume a year later, what they agreed on the land swap should be respected, should be adhered to. They haven't done that.
But now what has happened, I assume, is they agreed on a certain kind of map for a land swap. And then because it wasn't accepted, there's been more settlement taking place since then.
That's right.
So the map would have to be changed if they started.
No, just to give you just an example. For example, they agreed on any issue that they've agreed upon, and then as a matter of fact, they did agree about the right of the Palestinian right of return. They agreed on compensation and resettlement. There was an agreement on that. I would set it aside and not go back to it when the negotiation collapsed. They have to go back to the refugee problem. That's what I'm saying. And there were many examples like the small issues, big issues, they agreed upon, and I would set it aside. In negotiation, we call this, put it in the bank, so to speak. You go back to it time and again and again and again. Had they done that, they would have had the building blocks to reach eventually an agreement.
Okay.
Today, if they start negotiating, it's going to be again from scratch.
Uh-huh.
And the issue is becoming more and more intractable.
Okay, I think I've got a little bit of a picture now. Thank you. That really is very helpful. And Bob, I'd like to hear what you think. Well, I know that you know what Peace Now, what position Peace Now takes. Because you're the chair of the Toronto chapter, tell me about Peace Now as is that the most important support organization for peace act solutions, or can you think of another that is comparable in influence?
Obviously, I'm going to say it's the most important and the preeminent, and I truly believe that. But at the same time, there are other very important institutions in Israel that are doing assessments of different options. And there's a group called the Commanders, which are former commanders of the Israeli Defense Forces, of the Mossad security forces, of chiefs of police, the very senior generals who were running the security establishment. And they have about 80% of them joined together in this group called the Commanders, because they were commanders who are advocating peace, who are coming up with peace solutions all the time, because they say, and this is what Alon has been saying, it's not sustainable. We cannot continue to win every single war. The only possible solution is peace. Now, there's one other thing that Peace Now is saying, which very few other people are saying, and we don't even say it very often, but we are terrified of what we call the A word. And the A word, of course, is apartheid. And the deal of the century, if it were to be implemented, would look just like apartheid. And we don't see how Israel can remain a democratic society while controlling a whole bunch of people who don't have a government, who don't have rights of their own. And the longer that this goes on, the closer we slide towards apartheid. And right now, the defense is, well, we can't just give it up without a negotiation, or we can't just give it up because they might attack us, but it is not sustainable. I think this is what Alon has said, and this is what I underline.
As a naive observer, I certainly have already heard the word apartheid applied by people who, I mean, they're getting criticized for ever saying the word, but one could say it's already an apartheid situation.
Honestly, from my perspective, there's a de facto apartheid in Israel today. I mean, all you have to do is go to the West Bank for a few days. And when you have raids at night, when you have outright discrimination against Israeli Palestinians, forget even people in the West Bank, Palestinian West Bank or Gaza. I'm talking about Israeli Palestinians are discriminated against day in and day out. Israel is not Switzerland. Israel today is becoming more and more fanatic state. Look what, for example, Gantz, who joined Netanyahu, is supposed to be more centrist. He went along with annexation, more land of Palestine. It is almost unbelievable. So basically, you have now an absolute majority in Israel who no longer support the two-state solution, which is horrifying prospect. That is the problem we have, which means this is a recipe for continuing conflict and bloodshed, for as far as the eye can see. Because if I were a Palestinian, I would never give up my right. I would never give up my right. I was born here. My ancestors lived here 100, 200, 400, 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago. Why should I relinquish? Whether I was called Palestinian or not called Palestinian, it's irrelevant. That's where we are at today. So the longer they are waiting, the Palestinians, the longer they wait, the more difficult it's becoming, because Israelis moved from the left slowly to the center to the right. And that is really, unfortunately, was precipitated beginning with the Second Intifada in 2000. The Second Intifada really created a completely new dimension to the conflict. Whereas Israel before 2000 was willing to be more flexible, after the Second Intifada, they become much more hardened in their position against the Palestinians. But I want to mention to you, Bob, the commanders. I've been in touch with them on a regular basis, and they are absolutely right. Absolutely right. They've been preaching this for some time now. But I spoke recently of one of them, Ilan Mizrahi. Ilan Mizrahi used to be the national security advisor to Olmert. And I said, very recently, a couple of weeks ago, I said, Ilan, what's going on? He said to me, Alon, I tell you the truth. we are afraid to talk about it anymore. We are afraid to talk about two states. We are under tremendous amount of pressure and strain. It's becoming impossible. This is the fear that is today. Hillel Shankar, I don't know if you know Hillel Shankar. He's the editor. There's an Israeli-Palestinian magazine monthly that comes out. He is the chief editor, and there's a Palestinian one. And I wrote my most recent piece about the situation with the normalization with Doha. And he said to me, Alon, you can say what you can say sitting in America. We cannot say that here. We will be chastised. We will be threatened. Can you imagine? We're talking about Israelis living in the country are afraid to speak their mind. This could spell the danger of Israel as we know it.
And these are senior Israelis living there.
Yes.
These are not people who are riffraff or.
Exactly, and that is, and then when they are afraid to talk. Can you imagine? And you never seen people Israeli demonstrated about the economic problems. They demonstrated about the virus because it was mishandled by Netanyahu, just like Trump here. But they have never demonstrated, not once, to demand peace. How do you explain it?
Well, they do demonstrate it. It's just that we don't have the crowds that we wish we had, but we.
They don't. It's very insignificant. I never seen major demonstration. Hundreds of thousands of Israelis go to the Rabin Square and say, "We have to have an end to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict." There was never such demonstration.
Yeah, that's right. I'm saying that I agree with that, but I'm noting there are demonstrations. We just don't attract the crowds that I wish we did.
Yeah.
Which means, of course, that the population is very right-wing now and very.
It's moving towards more and more to the right.
Why? If you were to try to strategize about how to get from here to where you want to go, what kind of procedures would you pursue?
Here you may get a little disagreement because only a very small number of people agree with the position that I believe, and almost all of them are part of the Peace Now group, which this isn't an official Peace Now position, but it is a position that's very minority. I don't think there's any chance of solving this through negotiations as is. I think the only way that it will be solved is external powers develop a fair solution, which is pretty well the solutions that Alon has talked about, the ones everybody has agreed will have to happen. And then Europe, the United States, and Eastern Europe come together and say, this is what it's going to be, negotiate the details, but this is what it's going to be. There will be a Palestinian state. It will have borders. Now settle where there'll be. There will be Jerusalem. Jerusalem will be a Jewish city with Palestinian capital within it, much like wards in a normal city. And this is what's going to be. The Dome of the Rock is going to remain under control of the Muslims. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre will remain under control of the Christians. And this isn't something that needs to be wasted on negotiations. This is what's going to happen.
When has that ever happened?
Well, I differ somewhat from this a little bit. They will not be able to reach an agreement by themselves. Let me put it this way. Major power will have to be involved, specifically the United States, to a lesser extent the EU. But I can tell you this, as long as the United States continue to support Israel almost blindly, you're not going to be able to impose a solution on Israel. And this is why it's more of a domestic problem for Israel, for America, than even an Israeli problem. And what is the domestic problem? Look at what Trump is doing. Look what Obama has done. They all need to cater to specific constituency here. And this is the evangelicals. Evangelicals with 50, 60 million people involved, the Christians who support Israel blind. Israel cannot do wrong, period. they need the evangelicals to win elections. It's a plain and simple. That's a major problem. So Israel is a domestic American problem, policy issue.
That explains a lot to me. There's a discussion going on within the peace community among people who say we have to go along with Biden just because, of course, we don't want to do anything that might help Trump get reelected. So we have to go along with Biden. But the truth is, Biden is taking a terrible position on the Israel situation. So that must be the explanation. He's still reaching out to these Christian fundamentalists, evangelicals.
Yeah, look, Obama put the pressure on Netanyahu, did not go anywhere. The only person who really put a much stronger pressure was the Bush Senior, who froze, guaranteed loan because the then Prime Minister Shamir was not listening, and he froze the loan and all of that. But that also was temporary. So, but there's something that Bob said is very important to keep in mind, and that is the United States today, still today, is the only country that can exact concessions from Israel. The only country, not the EU, not Russia, not China. There is no other country that can force Israel to make certain concessions. So if you do not have an administration willing to put its foot down and say, this is the goal, this two-state solution. Jerusalem is this, refugees is this, let us now work out the details. You need an American administration willing to put its foot down. My problem with that, I don't see that happening.
Yeah. Oh boy.
Do you agree, Bob?
Yeah, unfortunately, on that part, I would love to be able to disagree. But the one thing that I would add to this, though, is that evangelicals are not so much pro-Israel because they want to see the type of people who live in Israel.
Oh, no, of course
they are pro.
You're right.
They are pro. In fact, some of them are anti-Semitic, but they are pro-Israel because of biblical prophecies.
Yes, Israel is a conduit. It is for them. Israel is a conduit for the return of the Messiah. Israel is a tool, not because of love of the Jews. That is not
where did that come from, anyway? You know, I was brought up in that kind of church, and I don't remember that was anything in the discourse then. It must have come up in the last 20 years or so, this notion that the second coming of Christ can only happen when under a Jewish state in Israel, or something like that. That's not historically long-lived, is it?
Well, it came to the fore in more recent decades, last 2 or 3 decades, because the Israel is, when you look at the history, the bilateral relations between Israel and the United States, you go back to Truman, when you recognize Israel, going back to basically 1948, you really don't find a single administration who did not support Israel, almost 100%. Mm-hmm. And that is why the Palestinians understand that. They understand that only the United States can get some concession, and then why they need the United States. But Abbas made a terrible, stupid mistake. When Trump recognized Jerusalem, he said, well, we don't need to discuss, we will not talk anymore to the United States. Well, who are you going to talk to? No one. Mm-hmm. No one. The EU could not force Israel to do anything. Who else? Russia is cooperate with Israel because there's 1 million Russians in Israel, and there's tremendous amount of cooperation. Russia is allowing Israel to bombard Iran in Syria. Without Russian consent, Israel would not have been able to do that. Mm-hmm. So there's no power other than the United States that can force Israel to do anything. And if the United States is not doing that, why do you think Netanyahu has been so successful?
Well, I hear that there are many American Jews who have changed sides, so to speak, who are definitely not pro-Netanyahu. uh, to put it mildly. And I think actually you mentioned this guy, Peter Beinart. Didn't you, in a paper that you wrote, Bob Cates? His point of view, which would be something like just turn the whole thing into a secular state, if I'm not misrepresenting it.
That's what he said.
Basically, that
He
sounds
gave
good to
up on
me, but I'm not
national
Jewish,
identity.
so I would think, well, maybe that's the answer, but I guess that's not going to be a popular answer either.
There are three main Jewish Jewish opinions in North America. You've got the religious and pro-Israel, pro-Zionist at all costs group. Then you've got a largely growing group of people in J Street in the United States, J Space in Canada, then quite a few progressive, we call it, groups that are, by the way, doing a lot of the things Alon is talking about, getting Palestinians to meet Israelis, we bring them here to Canada to meet at a camp in Canada on neutral grounds. So there's a lot of that. And then there's a third force, which are, in Canada, they call it Independent Jewish Voice, which is a group of Jewish people, not all Jews, but they like to call themselves all Jews, who are against Zionism and who want an end to Israel. Now, Beinart is really almost a lone wolf because he used to be affiliated with the Progressive Bloc, and he is now really on his own with his idea of a binational state. And he's very important because he had a great following up until now. I don't think anybody's paying much attention to him anymore.
The influence of the Jewish community in the United States is really way, way over exaggerated. I mean, people think AIPAC is such an influence on the American government. They have a little influence, but to suggest that they actually can dictate to the administration the policy toward Israel is way, way over exaggerated. That's really not the case. Israel has sway here in America, again, not because of the Jewish community, but exactly what we said before, very important element, and that is Israel as an ally in the region that in many ways actually guard U.S. interest throughout the Middle East. Mm-hmm. As a part of a security alignment. What Trump unfortunately has done, he could have done a much better job if he knew what he is talking about, or the so-called expert Kushner has any clue what he is talking about. They could have come up with, take what Olmert has been able to achieve and put that on the table and say, let's finish it. That would have been the case. Then they would have been able to reach an agreement.
A bit of optimism. There are things that can be done right now, even though I fear that there is no immediate prospect of peace. One thing that is really important to do would be to help the Palestinians in the West Bank rebuild their infrastructure. There's tremendous bureaucracy and corruption, with the result that they don't get their garbage picked up. They don't have proper policing. The sewers leak. The water doesn't always come. The electricity isn't always on. If Israel were to help the people of the West Bank to improve that condition, the prospects of negotiating a peace would go up a great deal. So that's one thing. And the other thing is there are groups, and I'm not as conversant with the States where you are now, but Heart to Heart in Canada, the New Israel Fund, which is all over Israel, United States, and Canada, which are making individual efforts to bring Palestinians and Jews together, to show that they can get along, to show that they both are human beings. And these efforts should be nurtured.
I appreciate, Bob, what you are saying. And thank you for having us, given us the opportunity to discuss this. I hope that we discuss it one more in a year or two, and we can have a little different approach to it, or more hopeful that something can actually happen.
I promise to invite you both back a year from now for sure.
This conversation is one of the weekly series Talk About Saving the World, produced by Peace Magazine and Project Save the World. Please visit our website at tosavetheworld.ca, where you can sign the Platform for Survival, a list of 25 public policy proposals that, if enacted, would greatly reduce the risk of 6 global threats to humankind. Come back next week for another discussion of a serious global issue.